My name is Gilad Gore, and I serve as Executive Director of the Nature Tech Collective. And it is a really proud moment for us as a team and as a community. Today marks the debut of the inaugural um, Cattle Tech Sustainable Beef Sector Map and Report. And why this is special is beyond the fact that this is an exciting and truly impactful space that is all too often not really seen as an area of great opportunity for nature positive transition. Um, and this report will make it abundantly clear that it's not only of huge impact, but there's huge opportunity for nature tech solutions to make this happen. It's also a special moment for us as a team because this represents um, our inaugural deliverable for an anchor member of ours who reached out to us with a challenge. This is one of the anchor member asked to remain anonymous, and they made it very clear that they want this report to be a public good. And their challenge, which is shared by many, I would argue the entire world, is that cattle isn't going anywhere. Cattle is a massive industry. It is a cultural point of pride for many, many cultures. You may have heard of cowboys or gauchos. Um, and the cattle industry is one in which, unfortunately, it is sometimes, especially the way it's built right now, is at odds with what we need in order to reach realignment in terms of our coexistence with the rest of nature. And this anchor member sought our support in helping landscape possible solutions coming from the world of nature tech, which they could use for their own needs, but equally that they could help others come to, inspire, and really accelerate the adoption of. So we're at our core, Nature Tech Collective is a category building nonprofit and a community. Many of you attendees are members of ours here in service of the nature positive transition. This report that our partners at Terra Genesis have really spent the last few months building out, and that several panelists here are mentioned in. This report is one of the primary deliverables for Nature Tech Collective, showing how to do this thing we call nature positive transition. And so I urge you all to see this as the first of the many. I urge you all to read the report, let the world know about it, please. If you have ideas on other such reports, if you have needs for these type of assets, don't hesitate to reach out to me or Paige or Amanda. Um, and yeah, with that, I'd love to pass the baton to our lead on this project from the Nature Tech Collective community and family, Amanda Pinelli.
Thanks, Gilad. That was a great introduction and great framing for what this project has been. I've been mainly in a coordinating kind of role of working with Terra Genesis and the team at Nature Tech Collective. I'm a part of our sister company, which is the Nature Tech Venture Studio, or sorry, Nature X Venture Studio. And we've been looking at all different opportunities to invest into and build companies in solution to this pathway of preserving and restoring nature. So I'm very excited about this report. I've spent years looking for solution sets, and it's nice to see everything in one place. I will say that the perfectionist in me is just like, it's not what we missed. Which entities did we miss, and what projects did we miss that we want to make sure are included? And I think, you know, at some point in time, we had to cut it off and get the thing published. And so I just want to note that. So that way, if you guys see somebody that you want to recommend for it for, you know, a V2 kind of thing, I think that these maps have to be living documents because we're evolving and we're building new companies and new initiatives all of the time. So I just want to state that. And the lens of this report, so we were talking about this a little bit just before this call, and the lens of this report really was commissioned by a US focused entity, and their specific needs. And so we did have quite a US lens, but we looked at tech on a global landscape. And we want to broaden this conversation into implementation also in a global landscape. And so you'll see that our panel here that we're going to have a discussion with is going to be led by myself and Tim Tenson, the CEO of Terra Genesis. And we have Nick Buckley-Biggs from AgriWebb, Daniele Cesano from LandPrint, and Anthony Yosifian from the First 30. So we have lenses of both solution sets and investor lens, and Terra Genesis will let Tim do his introduction on their landscape and everything that they touch. But I first wanted to give the floor to Lauren Dunteman, who played a very big role in actually writing the content of this report and conducting the interviews, and to give us her take on this experience, this report, this project, and the many other pieces that she touches in this world.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Like Amanda mentioned, my name is Lauren Dunteman. I am a senior associate with Terra Genesis, and you'll hear more about Terra Genesis when Tim is able to introduce himself as we get this panel started. But I wanted to take an opportunity to jump in here as one of the primary authors of this report to just share what some of my experience going into this as an author was. I kind of find it funny that my work is so focused on data and technology as it is today. It's a pretty large component of the work that Terra Genesis does. But that surprise comes from the fact that I've always actually kind of been data and tech averse. And I wanted to speak a little bit to where that apprehension comes from and where I'm seeing the industry moving today. I suppose where that comes from is that I've always worried that that technology is like a tool in a toolbox that can be used with various different mentalities, and they can also be designed with various different intentions. And when we look at the food system, we can see that many of the challenges that are being faced today are social and cultural and paradigmatic. And as you'll hear from the panel today, there are really, really exciting technologies in the industry. I'm excited with the way that the panelists are approaching this work. And in the interviews that I got to have in designing the report, my energy around technology really was enlivened because I see the spirit that is being brought into this industry. And at the same time, I hold that hesitation around how leaning into technology can create a future where it takes the heart and relationship development out of the challenges that we're addressing today, and can potentially limit our curiosity in taking really holistic approaches that also consider those social and cultural components. And so I, again, was appreciative of this opportunity to get to know the landscape better. And you'll hear from the panelists today the way that they're approaching the design of their technologies. And it is exciting to know that folks that are so dedicated to this space, whether they're designing technologies or investing in them, are also seeing the need to take that really holistic approach rather than just using tools as Band-Aids.
Yeah.
With that, Amanda, I'll pass it back to you. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. I think that's the most important thing that I've been taking away in the years that I've been playing in this space is being mindful of not trying to solve one problem while creating lots of unintended consequences and having that holistic lens. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Tim Tenson, the CEO of Terra Genesis.
Thanks, Amanda. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone today. As mentioned, I'm COO at Terra Genesis, and I'm also probably a big part of the reason why Lauren is working so much in data and technology for agriculture and nature. I have big passion for all three items, data, technology, and agriculture. It's been a big part of my work over the better part of the last decade. And I think it's important, though, to kind of shed light on something that Lauren was pointing out about how Terra Genesis works. So we're a regenerative design and development firm. We work with a variety of stakeholders from corporates to farm communities, indigenous communities, as well as all of the actors and stakeholders in between, funders, supply chain actors. And we're working to transform supply chains into supply systems. And what that means in the spirit of our work is that we're shifting our worldview from the world as a mechanism to the world as a living system. And this requires us to shift our thinking from thinking mechanistically to sensing living systems holistically, right? And when we think about this and what this means for the way that we interact, it's exchanges that are going from just purely transactional to being relational. And some of the projects that we've been working on over the last 2 years have had a really big focus on agricultural data, on technical applications to support sustainability, as well as, I think, broadly, some of the big challenges in sustainability in the livestock sector. Some of the projects that we've been really focused on and over these past 2 years has been a US-focused effort called the Grazing Lands Carbon Data Initiative, where we brought together in partnership with Open Team and facilitated over 150 different individuals and roughly 80 organizations represented across a supply system to look at and understand what are the challenges in understanding field level soil carbon dynamics. In grasslands, it's a huge challenge. There's a lot of idiosyncrasy in livestock production systems. And there's a question of how we effectively generate a calibration data set on a US basis that can help us model the dynamics of soil carbon. It's a huge challenge for corporates. It's a challenge for researchers. And our effort has been to understand not only what is that data gap, what is that model gap, but also what does it cost? What does it actually take for us to do this? We've also been working with the World Wildlife Fund and Global Methane Hub on a global grazing management platform. Our role has been as kind of the technical designer to support in trying to understand the gaps in biomass measurement in being used in a very practical role in management decision making. In other words, if you can time grazing events right, you can reduce the methane intensity of those production systems and increase animal productivity. But getting that data to the hands of producers all over the world is a huge technical challenge. We've also been working with an organization called Regen 10, who are trying to develop an outcomes framework that has global applicability in agricultural systems. And the big challenge has been data governance. So we've been working with them to develop the data governance framework, principles, and guidance for agreements that can help as their outcomes framework is deployed internationally to actually understand the farmers' needs and other stakeholders' needs in that process. And I'd be remiss not to mention what we're here today to talk about, which is the Cattle Tech Sustainable Beef Report.
Tim, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
So all of those different projects that you're working on, are those all public goods that people can actually see the outcomes from and check out? Or not, are they published yet?
There's some are published, some are in the process of being reviewed for publishing later this year.
I think sharing maybe the links to those, Lauren, maybe you can drop that into the chat, and sharing the links to those might be really interesting for this audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, not the least of which has been this Cattle Tech report. I think this is something that Lauren and I have been really excited about partnering with the Nature Tech Collective to share. And I wanted to share some of the top highlights that we walked away from that, we mentioned in the report, but I think are really important to help frame the discussion today. The first I want to highlight is that there was about 250 entities that we identified as being really driving forces behind innovation and cattle tech sustainability. But if you contrast that with, for example, the Nature FinTech landscape map that Nature Tech Collective has put out, it's about half of the entities that are represented in that. So for us, a real takeaway was there is a lot of need for further investment and innovation in sustainable cattle tech space. That there's a huge opportunity, but there just isn't enough of the kind of maturity that you see in some of these other sectors, right? We found that within this, there were technical challenges, there were commercialization challenges that have limited some of the development here. And there are also just foundational challenges. For example, the difficulties in forage quality data. Forage quality is a huge part of understanding methane intensity, animal productivity, and it's really difficult to develop the models in the first place. There's limitations with Earth observation data and the ability to get granular data about the field quality. There's also, when you think about it, a lot of emphasis, like methane intensity, on methane and carbon. And it was identified throughout the conversations that we had in the research that there is an immense amount of alignment and investment needed to understand biodiversity and water and those impacts in cattle systems. Further, there's a lot of work being done on genetics in the past focused on productivity, but not as much on adaptability, resilience. And I know Anthony's going to have some comments on epigenetics, and not just thinking about the genetics in themselves, but how they're phenotypically expressed, you know, how the environment helps shape the performance and the health of animals. Another huge part of this conversation came about the traceability, that in a US context, there's really, really poor traceability to the animal or the impacts. And that globally, though, this is still something that has yet to be fully resolved. And we really want to be focusing on how does traceability actually work to not just understand the provenance of an animal, but also understand the impacts associated with that. And, you know, finally, I think there's this component that can often go overlooked, which is the necessity of understanding the lived experience of producers. The conversation that we had in preparation for this, we highlighted just how important it is to be developing alongside producers, understanding their management realities, understanding their business realities, and that this will help drive not only more effective technology, but more likely adoption of technology, right? Maybe the final thing I'll say, because this came up, I think, in our conversation last night, is the importance of, when we think about nature tech focused on cattle, focused on sustainable beef in particular, that it comes down to health, right? It comes down to the health of the ecosystems these animals in. It comes down to the health of the animals, to the health of the producers, right? Not only their business and financial health, but their lifestyle. And I think further, the consumer. So when we think about sustainable cattle tech, we're actually just talking about healthy ecosystems, people, and animals. So with that, I will turn it back over to Amanda. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. That was a great kind of summary of where we landed. And what I'd like to invite now is the perspectives of these great panelists that we have with us. And I think we're going to, what I love about the conversation, our prep call really, is that we kind of land in this, how do we value the ecosystem services and internalize the externalities? And we have different approaches and different perspectives on doing that, whether we look at it from a risk perspective, we look at it from a measurement and data perspective, or we look at it from a health perspective. And I think you'll hear that from these three panelists. And so each one is going to give a little introduction of themselves and some takeaways from their understanding and their perspective of what we have published in this report and where they see this can be applicable and what's calling forth to the industry itself as a whole. So I'm going to ask Nick to introduce herself and kind of start us off.
Sure. Thank you, Amanda, and everyone for having me in this great discussion. Very excited to see the report come out. As a brief kind of personal intro, and I'll share a bit about what AgriWebb does. I'm an environmental scientist. I spent about a decade in the NGO sector working on large landscape conservation, working with cattle ranchers on landscape conservation, and then ended up in academia with a strong focus on grazing lands, climate, and conservation outcomes. From there, I ended up in the software space. You never know where your life journey takes you. I've been with AgriWebb now for a few years. And for those who aren't familiar with AgriWebb, we are a global livestock software company. We focus specifically on grazers, grazing lands. So we work with cow-calf producers, backgrounders, stockers, anyone with cattle, sheep, or bison that are really focused on those animals on grass and improving their management. The software platform's been around since 2014, came out of Australia originally, and we have a strong presence as well in the US, the UK, Brazil, also South Africa, basically the key places where we have large populations of grazing animals. And what producers really use AgriWebb for is to track their daily ranch records or farm records, depending on where you live. Everything from stocking rates, pasture rest, seeding, fertilizer, tillage, cost of production, and also things like employee management and calendaring and kind of managing the business side of your operation. We try to be a holistic tool for producers in that space, so that rather than having 5 or 6 different apps, one doing genetics data, one capturing grazing data, another one working on finances, producers can have it all in one place. We're very excited about the tech ecosystem in general. We're heavily partnership focused, so really leveraging the power of APIs and technical integrations with a number of other tech startups. So happy to chat about that today. But just to give you an example, we work with carbon calculators and MMRV groups, so those that are doing modeling of emissions, so that producers can take the data that they have in AgriWebb and permission it in a transparent way to be sent to a carbon calculator so that they can get a sense of their baseline or be part of a sustainability program without ever having to have spreadsheets or surveys sent out. We also work with a number of hardware partners. So many producers use things like weigh scales or ear tag wands, or even software providers that do use remote sensing to estimate forage. And we try to connect all of those opportunities, those technologies into the AgriWebb platform so producers can easily have their records in one place. And we're always looking for new partners. So if anyone on this call is interested, please reach out on that. But I think one of the things that I'd be particularly excited to talk about today is kind of the why around data collection. When we talk about livestock data, it's always, it's hard to get, it's not high quality. How do we actually get ranchers to collect data? And in my experience, you have to make it useful for them. Otherwise, it's an extractive exercise where you're asking them to share pretty valuable records for the purposes of a project that doesn't necessarily help them at the end of the day. So in all of our work, we're looking at how do we make the rewards flow back to the producers? How do we take their data and turn it into a carbon inset, a carbon offset, a sustainability premium, just better financial health for that operation, better access to green loans or sustainability linked loans? And we work with a number of kind of corporations and enterprises in that space to help finally reward producers for their good stewardship rather than pushing it onto consumers, really getting the companies in the supply chain to engage in a meaningful way. So excited to be here. I'll stop there, but
Nick, can you give the audience a little bit of a perspective on the adoption rate? I think yesterday you told us about what it was like in Australia. I don't know about the rest of the world, but in terms of the users and how maybe that'll actually demonstrate, how you guys really are understanding their needs and making it of value to them.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'll just put it in the context of me being a scientist and looking to join a company that had the most data possible, right? Because we can't start to learn the impact of management on ecosystem services until you have like significant data sets. And so the reason I joined AgriWebb was because of their traction in the livestock industry. In Australia, the platform has about a quarter of the grazing animals in Australia using AgriWebb on a day-to-day basis. That's sheep and cattle. I think all told, it's about 16,000 producers are on AgriWebb today. I often think of it in terms of number of acres. So 135 million acres are being tracked with geospatial data on where those cattle are at any given point. And, one of the things we think about as a software company is churn. So because we have a platform that producers pay for, right? It's a subscription service. They need to see value from it every month, every day. They need to see value. Otherwise, they won't renew their subscription at the end of the year. We are a for-profit company. And so what our engineers, we have a large product and engineering team in Sydney. What they're always thinking about is stickiness. How do we give more value to the producer? How do we, they use the term delight. How do we make something kind of cute or fun in the platform so that they come back to it and they get that sense of satisfaction, or we're saving them hours of time every day? That's the kind of thing that the engineers on our team are looking at, so that we can keep our churn below 1%, which is where it's at today.
Amazing. Yeah. That's great. I appreciate that perspective and that value added. It seems to me that you're playing an integral role, and I'm curious about all the different MRV companies that you're working with, but that's I heard everybody that there's an invitation there to reach out to her if you want to get integrated into her platform. So, yep. I'm going to turn it over to Daniele and then have Anthony bring us home with his perspective as an investor. Daniele is operating primarily in Brazil, but he has a broad background in a lot of initiatives in the cattle space beyond LandPrint, where he's active today. So Daniele, would you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you. So I basically, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's very exciting to be here, and just be engaged in this really important discussion about, reducing the carbon footprint of animals, which is, in agriculture is actually one of the largest emitters. And I a little bit more of a different, opposite background compared to Nicole, because I actually started in academia, did my PhD. I was a professor for a while at Columbia, and then I actually moved to the NGO sector and in the financial space. Then I basically started working and coordinating one of the very early Region Ag program in Brazil with cattle. Was a 10,000 hectares small holder family farmers basically initiative. Was funded by the Brazilian government, by the Inter-American Development Bank, by the German government, by the Dutch government. And I've been coordinating that for about 15 years. And then one of the big questions that eventually was absorbed in part by one of the states that we're working with, is the Bahia government, and at some level also by the federal government. And one of the key questions that we actually had when we were implementing the whole program was actually data. So we're always being asked, and it was back in the 2006. That's when we started. So was how can you actually are making sure that the program is really delivering impact to the farmer, is impact to the environment, impact to resilience. It was a big, that's when they started discussion about resilience in farming. And then the reason why when basically the program stopped, we started LandPrint. So LandPrint is actually LandPrinting farmers. So what does it mean, LandPrinting farmers? It means that we're actually measuring the stocks that are being consumed or produced in a supply chain. So we have a digital platform, it's a scalable digital platform, use different type of technologies, satellite images, ground truthing data, farmers book notes, and then you basically get all of this information in the platform, and we score farmer based on the level of where the farmer is to their maximum potential, or where they should be or they could be in terms of farming practice adoption, in terms of environmental asset. And then we started, so the slogan of LandPrint is LandPrint value nature the right way, because we're actually not valuing nature in the pricing, in food prices, and in financial
You should have sound saying,
in the financial terms of loans, for example. And until when, because when you go, one thing that we do every day is to feed ourselves, go to a grocery store, wherever, and buy food. So if doing this sort of, and then farmers, they own 40–50% of the global land. If that food that we buy, we don't have any information about if that food is degrading or regenerating the environment, then, and we don't include the sort of measurement and price that into the food system, it's very difficult that we're actually going to be able to regenerate and have a sustainable management of our world through, let's say, adaptive measures like the carbon market that are trying to, or biodiversity credit system that are trying to adjust our economy to the degradation, but is not really institutionalizing environmental pricing in commodities in financial terms. So this is actually what LandPrint is doing, and we're doing it through the compliance market, through risk models as well. So we're building the data infrastructure because we consider nature really as an infrastructure for our economy, and then has to be measured, and then it has to be in a way included in the pricing of food. Yeah, so that's a basic introduction about what we're
Wait, Daniele, can you explain how you're including the cost of nature into the pricing of food? How does that actually happen?
So basically, we build risk models. We are relating how different type of assets, environmental assets, and specific factors on these assets relate to productivity and production oscillations in relation to climate shocks, for example. So you can have two different farms on soy, can be cattle, but one next to another, but their response to climate shocks can be completely different in the way in which they are actually managing their land. And the management of the land is what we call the independent variable, because the farmer choice to adopt specific practices, and the outcome is the dependent variable, which is the increase in environmental assets, in key environmental assets, and in key factors that qualify and quantify these environmental assets. So relating farming practices, for us, a farming practice is a mathematical formula. So we actually develop algorithms that quantify the level of adoption of farming practices, how these relate to environmental stocks, and how these stocks relate to productivity and to production oscillations. We're able to develop algorithms specific to specific regions that are actually able to adjust the financial terms of loans and eventually of food prices to those specific assets, which will eventually gonna internalize the price and cost of environmental assets in our economy.
Daniele, there was, I want to underline this point because you made this in our conversation yesterday, that there's actually an issue that we're facing. And as you said, conventional produce, conventional food in general, through subsidies or other market realities, is artificially low and not pricing in the loss of value coming from the degradation of nature. And what you're trying to do with LandPrint is to identify how to value those underlying natural assets, such that if they were to degrade or appreciate, we can actually value that. And I'm curious, in some of your implementations of this, what have you learned so far about kind of what's required to actually start to make that shift in the price of regenerative goods?
So, for example, the price of goods depends a lot on the economical context you're working with, and especially on the supply chain. For example, 1 hectare of forest for a sustainable touristic resort is going to be completely different from an hectare of intact forest for a cattle farming, because the impact that this sort of stock, biodiversity stock and carbon stock, has differs tremendously from the use that you make of that stock. So fixing carbon prices, does it make sense? I don't know. I mean, and then considering that today you have the carbon price is based on cook stoves in South Africa, and renewable energy in China, and forest conservation in the Amazon, and it's a willingness to pay for the carbon, which is not really the real price, which is the big issue, is that you were not really paying the real price for the carbon. It's just basically a fake price. So, and then it's a corrective measure. So I think the key question is really try to link assets to the economy, and what is the relationship between these assets and the value that they bring to society. And this is not really being done correctly and in a scalable way because of the lack of digital technology. And then now we can do it today because satellite images is cheap, is free in many cases, and then the natural text, I think, play a big role in this respect.
Yeah, that's great context. Yes, if we could see ourselves valuing nature, and I think that we would see a lot of change for sure. I think the markets play into this, and I'm going to bring in Anthony. He's an investor, and Anthony, full disclosure on all of the companies you've invested into that are on the report, and this slight bias you might have from that perspective, I want you to just note those. I appreciate Anthony quite a bit because I also have a couple of years working with the Bionutrient Food Association and with Audacious, who is a portfolio company of Anthony's, and really appreciate that we've been talking about primarily like the climate impact, really from a methane and a carbon standpoint. But what does it really mean for sustainable beef and how the animal is raised and what the output of that, which is the whole point of this, right, is food. And that whole point of food is to nourish humans, right? And so what is the impacts of that, I think, is something I'm very interested in personally. And I think Anthony can bring in a great perspective on around health, not just of the animal, not of just humans, but also of the environment, and how there's a nexus point of those three.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity to speak about it. But obviously, when I heard about the reports and saw the reports, I was like, yes, finally. And it was great. You mentioned obviously earlier on that it's only 250 names, but I think that also, as all of you might know now or are learning, that when people say they're invested in agriculture, they're invested in nature, you just talked about a massive sector, and it just highlights there's so many investable opportunities. Like there was an in-joke on our fund that we are turning ourselves into a cattle tech fund, but I'll get into why that is in a second. But yes, my name's Anthony Yousefi. I'm partner of the First 30. So to disclaim, the First 30 references the first 30 centimeters of the soil. It's our reference to nature. We think it's the most undervalued asset. But look, I've been in building solutions in this space the last 10 years as well, so I kind of know how it feels to kind of what needs to be built, or how hard it is, and how hard it is working with farmers, and how we enable that as well. And the last 4 or 5 years, we've been building the First 30 on the premise of investing in nature, unlocking nature's value, but we've kind of circled in on that. The opportunity we believe is increasing, is basically targeting improvements in human health by regenerating nature, and that's the path, as Amanda rightly pointed out, like we think is missed slightly sometimes in the conversations, from corporates to carbon accounting, emissions counting. This is where the opportunity essentially lies. So we believe the food system is going through this transition of changing in quality. And as Amanda pointed out, some of the companies we've invested into are starting to show signal that food is not the same. You're probably not surprised. It's different everywhere, and we treat food as a commodity. And the truth is, it's not. That's not true. It's the decommodification is happening. All food is different, and you see that the argument is the same on carbon. Like carbon's not really the same everywhere. So Danielle was kind of calling out, but what we see from Audacious is data on the nutrient quality of animals raised in different environments. So, for example, pasture versus industrial, is that it's a completely different outcome or metric. It's incredibly more nutritious for us on pasture, the animal seems to be, than those, say, in the industrial environment. And probably no surprise as well. It's you are what you eat, the saying is. And I think as giving animals access to pasture or roaming around in areas of their natural environment, we're seeing in the data the outcomes and the measurements of the nutrient quality is much higher in those animals. And then so us as a fund, we're looking at technologies that can continue to kind of bridge that between the soil health and the human health. So I mentioned there Audacious, and then there's a call out in the report, which I think was great, was around like genetics, and the industry is over focused on genetics, and we totally agree. We've seen evidence that is true as well. And this is why we believe this is a great nature tech technology, is technologies around epigenetics, as was mentioned by Tim earlier. Epigenetics, looking at the expression of the genome. Like I think the best way to think about it is we know from evidence that if there are twins, one twin, I'm in UK, and let's say I have another twin who lives in America, I think it's very likely that we will end up with identical genome. We will end up looking different or have different outcomes. I may get cancer and my twin won't. And that is down to your environment, and it's down to your performance and everything else like that. So what we've seen in the data there from a company called Antler Bio, for example, is it is the management, it is the environment which is driving outcomes, beneficial outcomes. And so we need to be looking at those data points, but also the evidence around what the report is calling out for as well, some signals of the relationships that is happening. It's more of a holistic understanding of, it's not one metric which will drive the better productivity. It is, there are loads of factors going in there. And so we can use technology to get signal on nature, like epigenetics is an opportunity in that sense. But I just to kind of round off, I still see that, you know, we see that data is still very much a problem. Primary data, and it's flagged in the report. Primary data, better quality data can all go around, but for what reason? And we still think that the opportunity for biodiversity data, for example, can be expressed through, again, soil health makes better healthy plants. Better healthy plants forage means more healthy animals. More healthy animals equals more healthy humans. And there, I think we can all coalesce around data points which make sense, more valuable. We transform the value of this system. Let's talk about cattle, but like the food, when people talk about food being cheap, I will just call out the externality cost of nature. How about the externality cost of human health? This is why we call it, you know, we are trying to connect planetary health with human health. We have it quite clearly in the US, this report, and obviously here in the UK, we have a very similar health problem. And now we have obesity crisis, and so that cost is 2 times the value of the food system. So that is this opportunity for this sector, that this technology can drive a transformation in the value. And this is the opportunity that we see, and that's why I joke about that. I find ourselves becoming a cow tech fund because we see that this is an area where the change will happen. It's where the pain is. It's a $1 trillion problem. So I'm very excited for this report. It's great that you put it together, and looking forward to discussing more about it.
Tim, I see you're off mute. Did you have a question that you want to jump in with?
Yeah, well, you know, I'm curious, Anthony, because I think hearing from Nick, AgriWebb is collecting vast amounts of data that farmers are using in management decisions and business decisions. And Daniele is focusing more on the kind of land-based, ecosystem-based data. I'm curious, are there any gaps that you're seeing that you're really excited about in trying to fill those data gaps in general within those categories or outside that you think is critical?
And I want the panel to come off mute now because the floor is open here for discussion. So I would like you all to jump in, and if somebody wants to interrupt Anthony, you can.
Yeah, please do. I do. Yeah. I think it comes back to what I've seen is the value of data. Let's just go back to like the value of data. So it's much easier to get data points from a part in the value chain where there's perceived to be more value. Let's go back to beef. Beef is valuable compared to a vegetable. So we seem to have more ability to pay for that data point. It's a more valuable asset. So you look downstream and see that. The problem I've seen is, yes, it's flagged in the report like forage data or plant data health, soil health. And as much as we all believe that soil health is very important, I totally agree, it's building that value proposition to go collect that data point. And I see as you move towards the soil, the value perceived in the market, from carbon markets to everything else, does not currently hold a high value for that. So we've got to find the value proposition to go collect that data and make it and mobilize it and find good use. Now, I'm very aware that it's very clear that I've seen evidence that more biodiversity in the soil does drive more carbon sequestration. You know, it cycles more carbon, and it does drive quite seemingly more nutrients into the plant, more nutritional profile. So I'm very interested around, like, yes, seeing that nutrient deficiency in the plant. We see nutrient deficiency in the animal. It's just translating that to nutrient deficiency in the soil. So that's where I would point towards, and it marries the report as well on the forage side.
Can I just make rationalize a little bit on top of what Anthony is saying? If you take 1 kilo of protein produced through milk, it requires between 30 to 40 kilos of dry matter. Okay, 1 kilo of protein from milk. 1 kilo of protein from meat requires 150 to 300 kilos of dry matter. So what is the cost of carbon for producing that 1 kilo of protein, which at the end we want protein? Of course, there is the meat and there is the taste part, but producing 1 kilo of milk, 1 kilo of protein from milk from a carbon perspective is much cheaper than producing 1 kilo of meat through cattle. So there is a lot of, and these are the sort of I think equations that when we start talking about decarbonizing our economy, of course there is consumer preferences, but for example, beef from cattle probably should be taxed more from an environmental perspective than protein from milk, because they are actually consuming using less carbon. You know what I mean?
Can I challenge you on that? So
Yeah.
the problem with that calculation, which I think skews a lot of the LCA problems, is we need to be careful, I think, and I think we said, what is that biomass? Because that biomass is biomass which humans can't eat, a lot of it. So we need to separate, so that factor is true, but so if you actually say that biomass, if it's grass, trees, and I can't digest that. So the feed, what's it called? The energy required, the biomass required to create 1 kilogram of protein on like pasture, then is more balanced. But yes, for industrial feedlot cattle, that is an awful ratio. And that is what we're pointing towards. So I think there needs to be a rethink. No one talks about that very much, but I think that can really dispel a lot of the problems and separate those two types of beef out as well.
So another question then to you, build on that. Should we make high carbon beef production and high carbon intensive milk production illegal?
No.
Well, I think
I would never
Daniele,
personally go for that, and I would personally never take that approach. But I wouldn't make it illegal.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's I think part of the issue that Amanda brought up was just focusing on optimizing for one variable in a system, right? If you optimize for yield, you have our conventional production systems today, right? It can be reduced down to that. They've been optimized for yield. Now, if we talk about optimizing for reduction or elimination of carbon intensity or methane intensity, you end up with feedlots because there's no fiber in the diet, so you don't have the same enteric methane emissions. And so I think there's like a lot of caution about the kind of the binary logic or reacting to the dominant system. I think it's like in trying to identify the best interventions, I think there's something that's required of us to not just kind of react or overcorrect, but to actually like rethink, right? To kind of go back to first principles and think about what are the interactions in these systems and how can we optimize for the health of the system, right? I think, Anthony, to what you were saying earlier, that the health of the ecosystem translates to health of the animal, translates to health of the human. So if you were to like say optimize for the health of the humans, right, you follow that backwards through the system and you're going to make very different decisions than if you're just saying like governmentally, cattle is a blight on our nationally determined contributions and we need to just stop that. And I mean, I think we see from a social perspective, like, you try and reduce fertilizer use from farmers in Europe or Canada, and they'll revolt, right? There'll be tractors in the street shutting down traffic and commutes.
But then I think I have a question. Sorry.
Hold on, boys. Let's let Nick jump in. She's being a little bit more polite.
Fine. I want to pull us back to thinking about data and technology, and especially the producer, centering our discussion around the farmer, because at the end of the day, we need their engagement. And I might break a rule here and share a quick slide just to like take a high level view, because we've talked about a number of interventions. And I think it's good to put them in the context of like, what are all the different things we could be doing to improve the carbon footprint on grazing lands and land condition, right? It's not just about carbon. And they kind of fall into two buckets, right? You can either reduce emissions, reduce methane, reduce nitrous oxide through a variety of things. Maybe it's Bovaer or Rumensin, maybe it's a feed additive or seaweed. Maybe it's animal productivity, reducing mortality, genetics, epigenetics. That's all on the left-hand side. Then you have this whole world, which often is what regen conversations focus on, that's carbon removal. Maybe it's tree planting, maybe it's avoiding conversion in the first place where you have soil carbon losses when you convert grazing lands. Or maybe it's improved grazing management to reduce soil erosion, right? But these are kind of the two different buckets. And then the question is, okay, those are great interventions. What could you actually achieve if you implemented them in different countries? What do we know today from the academic literature about it? And there's a lot of studies that have been done, even though we need more research. There's quite a bit of evidence. For example, in Brazil, 57% improvement in the carbon intensity of beef is possible through a variety of practices. And there's literature reviews out here. So I don't want to belabor the point, except that we have a lot of research on specific interventions. Some of them aren't that sexy. Some are improving productivity, right? Improving fertility outcomes, reducing calf losses after they're born, just kind of simple things that have to do with efficiency, but have methane implications. But my real point is this one. If these are the interventions we're asking farmers and ranchers to adopt, and we want them to capture data so that we can start to quantify the outcomes, how much of this is actually stuff that we're asking them to do at the farm level? And I thought this report from the FAO was super interesting. I'm sure most people on this call have seen the report. There was a waterfall chart of, okay, this is where we're at today. This is where we're going to be in 2050 if we do a good job. And here are all the different interventions along the way that are going to get us there. I took that chart and threw it into a pie chart to see, well, how much of that is stuff that the rancher has to do, right? We're not talking about the yellow part that's in gold, which is diet change. Yes, that has to happen. Yes, we need some improvements in energy use, but the vast majority in green is stuff we're asking ranchers to do and to capture data on. And maybe it's, what you're feeding the animals. Maybe it's improved grazing management. Maybe it's breeding or epigenetics. But at the end of the day, I want us to focus on, if we need data, how do we help producers use the data to improve these outcomes? Because at the end of the day, sustainability is not about capturing data. It's not a data collection exercise and then we check the box and say we did our job. Sustainability is about helping producers use data to make better decisions, use technology to improve their management, right? That's, I think, the gold standard, the holy grail we should be working towards across the whole tech industry, and giving them the tools that help them in that process. That way, companies, everyone involved can not just quantify biodiversity or carbon, but they can actually show improvement over time because those producers have the tools that they need to make a difference. So thanks for letting me share that, Amanda. I just wanted to walk
I loved
through
it. That was great. That was great to ground us in some framing. I think that's really important. And Paige put a message in the chat. We're excited to keep this as a fluid conversation, and I would invite folks to jump in with any thoughts that they have about anything the panelists have shared thus far, or to put some questions in the Q&A. Make sure that we have time for your voices as well. But I also want to bring it back to, kind of like wrapping it up into the what now, right? And so what's the call? What's the call forth, right? And I think we kind of, Nick put it in perspective for us around data and on the farm level engagement. And I kind of want to also hear from the audience too about anything that we've been bringing up, or that I guess you haven't seen the report yet, right? So I was going to say anything that the report missed, but they haven't seen the report yet. But I think I want to make sure that channel of feedback and interaction is available as well. So within the report, there's contact for Lauren, who basically, put the whole report together for us, and to receive this, because I think that would also be applicable in the additional work that Terra Genesis is doing, and as a center point, really. So are there any other thoughts from the panel and any other points we want to make sure that we get to? I think one of them that comes up for me is a little bit around the annoying question that I seem to get on some investment forums that I attend, and how nothing about this report goes into this space around alternative solutions for beef, such as lab-grown meat and and industrialized beef production. But what I tend to get feedback on as I walk around the world as an advocate for sustainable beef production is, yeah, but how are you going to feed the whole world like this? And so it's an annoying question to me, but because part of it comes back to what I think Anthony was talking about, which is, if we improve the quality of what we're eating, we actually don't need these massive amounts of it, and our bodies start to understand and start to crave less food, and we'll actually have less of an obesity epidemic. But if we actually start eating food that is rich in phytochemicals, and that is a part of this analysis is going to be launched in partnership between the Bionutrient Food Association and Audacious The public workbook will be available on December 16th, and then there'll be an announcement around it in January. So look out for that. But that will start to identify the differences in health as it relates to beef and pasture raised versus grain fed. And so I want to put that question out to the panel and anybody else, and we'll start to field some of these questions coming in as well in the meantime. Anybody thoughts? How to feed the world?
You have a few questions as well in the chat.
Okay.
I can respond to this. I mean, I guess maybe a counterpoint. I think we still have a massive food supply challenge, even though in the US, you know, we have, I think the US and the UK, the reports I've seen, eats 5 times the amount of red meat per week that the medical community recommends. But of course, that's really spread across economic classes, you know, with a variety of contexts, they're influencing it. But at a global level, we still have 2 billion people who are facing food insecurity. We have a major need to have drought and climate resilient livestock production system. So I wouldn't say that we've, you know, figured out we have enough beef and now we just have to dial in the nutrient outcomes of it. I think that a lot more research is still needed also on how specific management practices drive improved nutritional outcomes. And we're still at the early stages of that research with, you know, barely literature reviews available for it. So I think it's important that that research happen and a data be captured at scale in different geographies to know more. But there's still such a huge challenge already today on being able to continue the production of red meat, of all livestock products in a way that's sustainable for the environment, but also meets food security needs.
Yeah, and then we have a question here in the chat is what about the business value of biodiversity livestock production? I think, Tim, you brought up the importance and the lack of focus on the solutions and measurement and even alignment on biodiversity measurement. Do you want to maybe respond to that?
Yeah, to be honest with you, I'd also be interested to hear Daniele's thoughts on this. I think there's a lot of talk about biodiversity credits and valuing biodiversity. But there's also a lot of difficulty because there's not clear alignment on what constitutes biodiversity and how to measure it in a unified way. And I think that really kind of holds us back from being able to operate at scale and valuing biodiversity or having a clear business justification. I think there are also challenges in that a lot of the biodiversity research in grasslands is not as well funded and well developed as in other ecosystems. And I think that also can hold us back. You know, there are strong limitations when it comes to using Earth observation data, for example, because of noise to signal. When you start getting really thin bands of electromagnetic spectrum and trying to go at high resolution, it just, there's too much noise in the data. So, you know, then it comes to needing field sampling, which can be labor intensive, costly to develop the data sets. So I think there's that, there's kind of the technical challenges. But I think I haven't yet seen a really good fit for companies in supply chains for valuing biodiversity. They have internal prices on carbon, but they don't have internal prices on nature. And then I think even further, when we look at the broader kind of market environment, I see a lot of calls, particularly from financial and insurance institutions, for understanding, valuing biodiversity. And so, you know, I see opportunities kind of in insurance and finance as the data as being a de-risking measure, as being something that's providing some sort of guarantee. But yeah, interested to hear other thoughts as well.
Stephanie, did you want to comment on that or clarify?
Yeah, that was my question, just to have a dialogue, just to throw something out there. So I'm the founder and CEO of Earth Analytics Group, and we've been monitoring the environmental impact of food production, including livestock, for 15 years. So we have done extensive work on monitoring biodiversity, not just in crops, but in livestock and in mixed farming systems. So I'd be happy to talk about how we've approached the challenge. I think some of the comments that were made with the slides from AgriWebb were spot on, but they're focused on the carbon cycle, carbon and nitrogen and productivity, and looking at the interplay between those things, as opposed to looking at a more comprehensive view of natural capital in terms of the whole stack of environmental services and how those tie back to an economic value proposition. So we have done extensive work on that in terms of looking at the diversification of forages and how that helps with feed conversion efficiency in dairy cows, in terms of how do you tie biodiversity that matters back to an economic proposition for the producers, so that an organization like Nestle that's sourcing milk for the Kit Kat bar comes up with a set of requirements for biodiversity monitoring that actually makes sense and pencils out for the producers. So we've got several case studies of how we're doing that work now in Wales, in the UK, that I'd be happy to talk to anyone about offline. The comments about soil biodiversity, I think, are really important in terms of looking at soil health, how to characterize that, how costly is it to collect the information on the ground versus what can you use Earth observation data for. So we have a specific set of analytics that leverage different combinations of technologies, both measurements and models, based upon what the level of specificity of the decision is that needs to be made on the ground, whether it's for a national inventory for like nationally determined contributions for greenhouse gas emissions budget versus management practice decisions from a primary producer point of view versus offset or insets in the supply chain versus an actual financial services instrument in terms of what level of rigor. So I think back to the comments that were made previously about how difficult it is because there are no standards for measurement or monitoring, or it could get really expensive. I think it's always looking at this in the context of why are you collecting the information and how does it inform what type of decision on the ground. But anyways, I just wanted to contribute that.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. I'm sorry, we're over time, and I just want to make sure I flag any of the questions that were in the chat to the panel. We'll try and jump to and just kind of, you guys are already responding to most of them. I think you already got most of them. So that's really great. I wish we could continue this conversation, really. I think, and I wish we could just open up the floor and just have a big debate, because I think there's a lot to be said here, and there's a lot of expertise I can see is in this room as well that could contribute with this. So I think the invitation, and I'll pass it to Paige to close this out, but I think the invitation is to stay in touch and certainly reach out, take a look at the report. Please provide us feedback and comments, and yeah, I'll turn it over to Paige to close us out.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you to everyone for writing and organizing this and speaking today. That was so fascinating. And yeah, thank you to the audience for being here. This was one of the last NTC Nows of the year. Next week, we're going to be talking about our impact report and kind of closing out the year at NTC, talking about also what we're doing in 2025. So yeah, the invitation is join us next week as well. Download the report, interact with the LinkedIn post and repost it as well for greater visibility. And that's it. Many, many thanks.
Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for your work, your amazing expertise, and contributing into the space. Really appreciate it. Okay.
Thanks so much.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Everyone.
Bye.